Hello, my name is Malcolm Skinner and I'm a solicitor in the LexisNexis PSL private client team. Today I'm joined by Andy Wood, the founder of the Enterprise Tax Centre, who's going to discuss international pensions. Andy, welcome.
Welcome.
International pensions, that sounds an immensely complicated and wide subject.
Yeah.
Exactly what do you mean by that, and what are we going to cover today?
Yeah, well, I think it is a very broad subject. So what I'm going to do, if I'm allowed, I'm going to sort of set my own terms of reference and probably make 2 points. The first being that clearly anybody can set some assets aside on an informal basis and notionally save those up for retirement, so it produces some income and capital when they no longer going into work, as it were. So often you will get clients who perhaps have built a buy-to-let portfolio to provide them with some retirement benefits. So we're not going to talk about that type of scenario today, though, that informal type of arrangement. Secondly, clearly most jurisdictions around the world, clearly including the UK, but other jurisdictions will have some kind of regulatory or tax framework to encourage people to save for their retirement. And we're not going to cover that type of arrangement either, so you might be thinking, well, actually, what are we going to cover? What we will cover is essentially the type of offshore arrangements that the UK tax code is hardwired to recognise, and then what the consequences and I suppose opportunities might be as a result.
Okay, so basically then, what ways do the UK tax code recognise overseas pension arrangements?
Sure. I mean, there are principally three, I suppose, types of arrangement that the UK code does recognise. The first is something called, and in no particular order, the first is called a qualifying non-UK pension scheme, or a coops. There's lots of acronyms in this area, but the first one is coops. The second is a qualified recognised overseas pension scheme, which is a coops. And the final one I've got on my list is called a Section 615 scheme, which is obviously the catchiest of the lot. In terms of that final one, the Section 615 scheme, the Autumn Statement recently essentially changed the rules such that you'll no longer be able to make any new contributions to that type of scheme. It's actually, I suppose, a type of UK approved scheme where you could make provision for overseas workers, so people working overseas and performing non-UK duties. But as I say, because that's pretty much redundant now, we won't really talk about that today.
Okay. So to use your acronyms, the acronyms, what about coops? What are they, basically?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, coops, and we'll also when we get into coops, we'll pretty much say the same. They're not really things that you can wrap up in a bow. Products, I suppose. They're just, I suppose, definitions in the tax code that if you satisfy those conditions, there is some kind of effect of doing so some kind of benefit of qualifying under that definition. And for coops, essentially is an inheritance tax exemption. So if you're offshore pension scheme, and it applies to offshore pension schemes only, but if your offshore pension scheme satisfies the definition of a coops, then there is an exemption for inheritance tax. So the value within that pension scheme is a statutory exemption which excludes it from any person's taxable estate. Now the definition in inheritance tax legislation is very, very thin. There's not much there at all. It is effectively just a signpost to a statutory instrument, the regulations, and that tends to be where the meat of the definition is. As I hopefully have made clear, quite happily to over-egg the pudding a little bit, but a coops is a pension scheme. It is to be used to provide retirement benefits, and therefore it isn't, I suppose, an overt way of avoiding inheritance tax, which I suppose is slightly perverse, and it is it is an inheritance tax exemption.
Indeed.
But there are reasons why, if you were to go down that route, the tax analysis in particular would fall apart.
So you have to be able to qualify for this QNAB. What sort of qualifying conditions are there in order to do that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the qualifying conditions are found in statutory instruments, and the regulations are, let's say, they're rather thorough, and really, I suppose, it is the job of the pension scheme provider to have gone through those regulations, you know, and ticked off each of the conditions in there. And it's very, very difficult to have a look at these things in a vacuum. What you need is, first of all, you need to know a little about the jurisdiction which is under contemplation, because you are looking at things like whether pension schemes in the particular jurisdiction are recognised for tax purposes, whether there is a regulator in that jurisdiction, and then you look at, I suppose, the contents of the scheme rules and see whether it meets the regulations from that perspective as well. So I don't really want to go into a load of detail on that today, other than say that really the QNAP provider should be able to tell you whether it meets the various
For our
conditions.
viewers, if they're interested, read the regulations.
Yeah. Precisely.
So I'm going to make a contribution to a QNAB. I mean, what's the tax situation, ignoring the IHT for a minute, tax situation in making those contributions and in respect of the QNAB itself? Yeah,
sure. And I think, Malcolm, you mentioned about if I'm considering making a contribution into a QNAP, it does tend to be individuals who contribute into QNAPs. Employers can make them on behalf of their employees, but it tends to be individuals who make them. There are some specific complexities which result from employers making contributions on their employees' behalf. So I think today, just for the sake of time, I think I will concentrate, I suppose, on individuals making contributions. So if I'm an individual, I've got my QNAPs and I put some money in, what are the consequences of doing that? Anybody who's familiar with the UK registered pension schemes will be aware that, generally speaking, you get some tax relief from that contribution into the pension scheme. The amount or availability for tax relief will depend on the size of the contribution, I suppose, and whether, in relation to the annual allowance, and also more recently, I suppose, the level of your income for a particular year. A QNAP, it's important to note, making a contribution into a QNAP doesn't qualify for income tax relief at all, so you don't get the benefit of that relief going in there. I suppose the other side of that coin is that because it isn't a registered pension scheme, you don't have to worry about the annual allowance. So if you have, let's say you have your UK registered pension scheme, you may contribute some money into that registered pension scheme so that you maximise your relief on the contributions you made into the registered pension scheme. And then you might think, well, actually, because a QNAP potentially has some flexibilities from, let's say, an investment perspective, you may want to put the excess into the QNAPs, and that won't have any negative sort of impact from an annual allowance point of view. So I think in old parlance they used to call them sort of top hat schemes. I think from an inheritance tax point of view, if you are making a genuine contribution into a QNAPs to provide retirement benefits, then because you're essentially exchanging money for rights in the pension scheme, that shouldn't be a transfer of value for inheritance tax purposes, so you don't have any issue with it being, say, a chargeable lifetime transfer or a potentially exempt transfer. It just is a bit of a non-event for IHT purposes, the contribution. Of course, when you are talking about pension contributions, you might not necessarily only be talking about cash.
No.
You might be thinking about, I don't know, I've got some buy-to-let properties in Warrington or something like that, and I want to park them in the pension scheme. Well, you need to think about it, if those properties are standing at a gain, and if they're back-to-back properties in Warrington, they might not be, but you need to factor in that that's probably going to be there's probably going to be a chargeable gain there. Generally speaking, though, the other issue with property is stamp duty, land tax. That shouldn't be a problem if you're contributing value into the coops, because there's no chargeable consideration there. So that's probably not going to be an issue in that scenario.
Okay. So basically, if we're putting cash in, quite simple. If we're putting assets of any other description in, not so simple.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's great. Income derived from any of these sources. What's the situation on income tax derived from any of these sources?
Well, in terms of, so the coops again, just to be clear, it's likely to be a trust-based scheme, and the trustees are likely to be outside the UK. So you have non-UK trustees receiving the income. So if it is UK income, then the trustees are going to be subject to UK tax. So if they directly receive that UK income, they're going to pay tax. So what you might want to do in that type of scenario, depending on the assets which are held and the income being produced, you might look to hold that indirectly via some kind of non-UK wrapper. Even if it's just a non-UK company, you might find that's quite effective in terms of the tax analysis. If, of course, you have UK real property, so UK bricks and mortar, then you're going to have to contend with the non-resident landlord scheme, which isn't necessarily too onerous, but you've got obviously got to apply for that. And I think that is an interesting or an important point anyway, that actually a coops, because it isn't a registered pension scheme, it can invest in residential property. That those taxable property rules don't apply to a coops. So that can be quite advantageous for somebody who wants to invest in those back-to-back properties in Warrington that we spoke about. If you have non-UK income arising to non-UK trustees, it shouldn't be subject to UK income tax.
CGT?
Yes, so CGT. Again, CGT certainly was a very unsophisticated tax until recently, and that that's setting aside any of the anti-avoidance rules which apply. But the enduring sort of basic principle was always that if you're non-UK resident and you make a gain on the disposal, then there would be no UK capital gains tax, even if that asset was in the UK. And of course, as part of Mr. Osborne's attack on buy-to-let landlords again, from April 2015, if you are disposing of residential property, then part of that gain that is attributable to growth post April 2015 is likely to be within in the charge to tax for a non-resident. With a coops though, as long as that coops meets the definition of an overseas pension scheme, then it should still benefit from the statutory exemption which is afforded to UK registered pension schemes. Now I say if, up until very recently, that wasn't a big issue, but I do note from the autumn statement there is an intention to amend the definition of an overseas pension scheme. So very shortly we will get.
so Monday we'll look again.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Right. We've established we're putting money, cash, assets, whatever into the coops. Now I'm obviously going to want my retirement benefits in due course. So how can you take those benefits?
Yeah. I mean, drawing benefits is going to be very similar with respect to coops as it would be for UK registered pension schemes. So essentially, you're looking at only being able to draw benefits from age 55, and you're looking at a split such that 70% of that accrued fund essentially needs to be provided, needs to be there to provide an income to the member of the scheme. A maximum of 30% can be provided through as a lump sum. There's always that rather sort of peculiar rule that if you receive a pension income from overseas, only 90% of it was taxable. Again, as I say, rather strange rule which I never could quite fathom out. Again, they mentioned in the autumn statement that they were going to look at addressing that, which I'm sure isn't good news for the 90% rule. And also, I think that there seems to be a suggestion that they may be looking at bringing the taxation of the lump sum in line with UK pensions as well. I'm not quite sure whether that will necessarily be detrimental. But I say it wasn't particularly specific in terms of what was produced in the autumn statement announcements.
Devil in the detail again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, obviously the patently advantages for using coops, and when do you see them being used?
Yeah, I think the most popular use is as I've alluded before, where you have, it probably will sit alongside a UK registered pension scheme, where you have somebody perhaps who is using up their tax relief in terms of a UK registered pension scheme, but as the sort of amount of that relief has been eroded over the years, they may want to make additional pension provision, and therefore the excess will go into the coops. Again, because I tend to advise quite active, and I suppose people who probably like to call themselves entrepreneurial, and some of them maybe are, is that the attraction of being able to sort of have a greater choice of investment, being able to put the money into, for example, residential property is quite attractive to them. So that's kind of, although you're not getting the relief going in, you've got a bit more sort of freedom in terms of what you invest in. A couple of other areas that I see that I've seen more recently. As I said before, if your coops meets the definition of being an overseas pension scheme, then potentially that falls outside the non-resident capital gains tax rules, which were introduced in April 2015. So that might be of interest to clients. And more recently, there seems that if you have, say, a non-dom client who has set up an excluded property trust with UK residential property in there, up to now is outside of anybody's estate for inheritance tax purposes from the 6th of April, won't be. Actually looking at maybe decanting that into a coops before April might be quite attractive, because you would then benefit from the IHT exemption for the coops rather than the revised excluded property definition.
Okay. Well, that inevitably, having dealt with coops, brings us on to curops.
Okay.
And basically, what is it? What are they?
Well, it's a very similar answer, I suppose, to that for coops, and that it is a status which is bestowed on a pension scheme by the legislation, and it's a bit of a build through the legislation, and again, the draftsman has kind of delegated the responsibility to the statutory instrument, the regulations, and you find that build, first of all, a scheme has to meet the definition that I've mentioned before about being an overseas pension scheme. It then has to meet a few more conditions to be a recognised overseas pension scheme, and once you arrive at being a recognised overseas pension scheme, or a ROPS, getting the sort of Q before they're up, so you become a QOps, that's mainly a matter of promising to sort of make sort of various reports to HMRC on a regular basis. So that's more of an administration burden. So that's what a QOps is.
Right, so why would anybody want a QOP? What is the point of them, if you see?
To answer that question, I suppose it's useful just to examine why they were introduced. And essentially, it was introduced for scenarios where you have somebody who's been living in the UK, they emigrate, they go and live overseas. And a scenario where perhaps they want to take their pension out of the UK to be a bit nearer where they've moved to, I suppose, or perhaps hold it in a third jurisdiction. Now, if you were to emigrate overseas and you to open a pension scheme in that jurisdiction, if you were to take a transfer of funds from your UK registered pension scheme and that was to be paid into a non-UK scheme somewhere overseas, then without the QOps status, then there will be a tax charge on that, that shifting of the funds. So if the destination pension scheme, so the overseas pension scheme, qualifies as a QOps, it allows you to move the funds from the UK scheme to the QOps without triggering that tax charge.
But presumably in those circumstances there must be a genuine reason for making that transfer.
Well, it's an interesting point, because although the rules essentially are brought in to deal with, I suppose, internationally mobile people, so people who have become non-resident, there isn't any requirement in the legislation to be non-resident or indeed be contemplating becoming non-residents. However, if you see what comes out of HMRC in relation to this, they're very strongly put forward reinforcing that the policy intention was that these are essentially available for people who are non-resident or thinking about becoming non-resident. So that's probably something to bear in mind when you're advising clients.
And tax treatment, to round it off?
Yeah, so there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, the ongoing tax treatment of a QOPS is going to be very similar to a QNUPS. In terms of the inheritance tax analysis, a QOPS is almost certainly going to be a QNUPS. I can't really think of any scenarios where a QOPS wouldn't be a QNUPS. You can't instantly apply the same in reverse, because a QNUPS often won't be a QOPS. But if you've got a QOPS, you can pretty much guarantee it will be a QNUPS and will benefit from the IHT exemption. One big difference is to do with the taxable property rules, in that although because a QNUPS isn't a registered pension scheme, the taxable property rules don't apply. Where you have a QOPS, and because you have taken funds from a UK pension scheme, which have had UK tax relief, and ported them overseas, there's a certain hangover from that UK registered pension regime, and one of those hangovers is that the taxable property rules will continue to apply. So the QOPS can't invest, say, in residential property or tangible movable property. So that's something to be aware of, that you can't take a UK SIP, put it in a QOPS in Malta, and then start investing in those Warrington
property. Yes, our back-to-back ones. Patently, if the QOPS is taken abroad, which it is abroad rather, we've transferred the funds over there, how do I take my benefits whilst I'm abroad from my QOP?
Yes, so again, very, very similar because together within the QOPS definition, you have to very, very closely mirror the UK registered pension regime. So it is broadly going to be taking the benefits at 55. Again, as with QNUPS, it's providing providing 70% must be used to provide income. The balance can be as as a lump sum. Obviously in the UK the last few years we've been able to, in one fell swoop, essentially draw down your pension. So in 1 year you could essentially withdraw all your pension benefits, subject to income tax, obviously, but you do have that flexibility in how you draw that down. They don't necessarily apply to the coops for various technical reasons. So you just have to be very careful that essentially the jurisdiction and the scheme allow or incorporate those pension flexibilities. So for instance, just because I suppose I mentioned Malta already, a coops in Malta will potentially allow you to access those pension freedoms. Other jurisdictions, particularly ones which are outside the EEA, perhaps less so.
Wow. That's a very good lesson on QNUPs and QROPs. Andy, thank you very much. Thank you for coming in and telling us.
No problem at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.